gotta go. I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map. I'm the map. I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there, I bet. I'm the map. 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 I'm the map.
All right, we're here for the last installment of the Integument and General Special Senses unit. We are now moving on to the integumentary system, one of the smaller units we cover here. So let's just get it on with. So what's the purpose, structure, and function of the actual integumentary system? Believe it or not, the integumentary system is the largest system in the entire human body in terms of it having the largest organ. The skin is, in fact, the largest organ in the human body. You can take the integument system and you can divide it into two components. You have the cutaneous membrane, which is comprised of the superficial layer called the epidermis. This is what we would call actual skin, or the epithelium, and the dermis, which is the underlying connective tissue. So really and truly, you can take that and you have the first one. This is a cutaneous membrane, which is the epithelium and the dermis. So if you're looking at your skin, this is the exposed surface out here. You have this epidermis layer here, and then you have the dermal layer here. One big thing I need you to pay attention to is the fact that the epidermis does not have a blood supply to it. The blood only exists within the dermis. Looking at it again in cross-section, if you were to cut your skin like cake, you would see that the epidermis is the smallest of the layers and the dermis is the largest. So in order for you to bleed from a cut, you have to pass through the epidermis and actually reach the dermis itself. Also, what I want you to see is the number of structures that are located up here in the epidermis are rather limited compared to the number of structures that are in the dermis. You have to think about what the possible function of the epidermis is, and it's really for protection against the external environment and keeping what's inside your body. So really all you're going to see is the hair shaft, maybe a sweat gland pore. Other than that, you don't see many structures. Everything else is going to be located down in the dermis. The second major grouping of structures in the integumentary system are going to be your accessory structures. These are going to be your things like your hair, your sebaceous glands, your sweat glands, your nails. Sebaceous glands are going to be those oil glands. Looking at another picture here, again, just another different type of picture involved with the integumentary system. You have the small layer right here, very little structures in there. You will typically have a sweat gland duct traveling through there and exposing a sweat gland pore, but that's the epidermis. Then you have the dermis, and the epidermis actually is going to be comprised of this layer here and this pinkish layer that kind of bobs up and down right here. Accessory structures. One of the most creepy structures you have is in fact going to be fingernails or toenails. If you'll notice, you will see how that fingernail is arranged. You can now understand also why the concentration of the fingernails is one of the biggest and oldest forms of torture. Can you imagine shoving something underneath this or pulling this out? It drives me insane. So you have your bone. Believe it or not, your fingernail actually travels almost all the way down to the bone. You have things like the cuticle, the luna, the nail body, the nail root, which is the side of where it grows, but any of the free edge. We aren't going to concentrate on this. What I need you to know is, however, fingernails, accessory structure. So this is getting into, again, just another visual of the different layers. You have the epidermis, the dermis, and what we call the hypodermis, which isn't really and truly necessarily part of the actual integumentary system as much as it is just a layer that's kind of grouped in with the integumentary system. It's more of a connective tissue layer. Okay. What does the integumentary system do for you? Well, the most obvious function you should probably think about is protection. It keeps all the underlying tissue, organs, and all that stuff safe from impact, chemicals, infection, fluid loss, things from puncturing the body. If you really think about it, your skin is waterproof. If it wasn't, when you jumped in a pool, you would soak up like a sponge. So protection is a huge thing. The other thing it does is temperature maintenance. It actually helps you regulate heat gain and loss. So yes, there's things like sweat glands, but you also have to think about the fact that blood vessels closest to the skin help with heat exchange. You also have the synthesis and storage of nutrients. If you ever hear somebody say, I want to go outside, I need some sun, believe it or not, sun does have some positive effects for you. One of the biggest things is it helps you synthesize or create vitamin D. You cannot create vitamin D or use vitamin D in your body without exposure to sunlight. It contains adipose tissue, so believe it or not, it has the storage of nutrients factor, meaning energy. It also has sensory reception, which we did get into in the senses and the senses portion of this. But you have touch, pressure, pain, temperature sensations, all of those fantastic things. And then the last thing is you have excretion and secretion. This is anything from salt, water, organic waste, and milk for in reproductive purposes or for the nursing of young. So this is the best thing I can tell you in terms of relation to this is when you sweat, it tastes salty. It's comprised of water and some of the salts that you are secreting. That's why things like Gatorade are so important, or they say they're important, is because they actually contain electrolytes for the replenishment of some of those essential salts that are necessary for your body that you actually end up excreting during sweating. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into the different layers. First, we're going to talk about the epidermis. There's actually two different types of epidermis. You have what is called thick skin and you have thin skin. Thick skin is 5 layers, thin skin is 4 layers. The thick skin you're typically going to find palms of your hands, bottom of your feet, thin skin pretty much everywhere else. The layers of the epidermis itself can be comprised of layers. We are going to memorize it in terms of 5, even though 4 is the more common in thin skin. So you have, and keep in mind, we're going from deep to superficial. I like to, in these notes, they're going to go from deep to superficial, but actually when I memorize them, I kind of like to memorize them from outside going in. That's just me. But you have the stratum germinativum. These are new cells of the skin. They're deep in the epidermis. They're the first layer. And what they are stem cells. Stem cells are cells that haven't really been fully told what they're going to become. And what these cells are, they are generated and they begin to grow. And their main job is to eventually turn into and move upward towards the surface through the layers to become the actual skin themselves. That's exposed to the external environment. The neat thing about the stratum germinativum is actually the ridges and bumps that are created from the stratum germinativum are actually what generate your fingerprints. You have the stratum spinosum. These are cells from the layer below, so these are now cells that used to be in the stratum germinativum that have now moved up and they've become a little bit more specialized, starting to form that outer layer. The third layer up is called the stratum granulosum. These consist of cells that are from the spinosum, and these cells actually reach a point where they stop dividing. So they're kind of like a mature form of the skin cells. They stop dividing, and what they start making internally is a protein called keratin. It's a very durable and water-resistant protein. This is the protein that hardens your skin a little bit. It's also the protein that hardens your fingernails and your hair, makes them waterproof, durable, and resistant. From there, the cells will continue to move up until they reach the stratum lucidum. In this particular layer, it's only present in thick skin. It's got this glassy layer. The cells are flattened and densely packed together. These are typically areas where you will have extreme exposure to stresses, particularly pushes and pulls. That's why your feet has them in your hands. And these cells that are flattened and densely packed are filled with keratin. The fifth layer is present in both thick and thin skin. The stratum lucidum is the one that's only present in thick skin, but the stratum corneum is the outermost or superficial layer of your skin. It's flattened. These cells are no longer alive. They are dead epithelial cells, and what they contain is a large amount of keratin. This keratin, again, waterproofs, makes it durable, and these cells are what are called keratinized. It's a chemical reaction that causes them to stay together or stick together. The downside of this is the stratum corneum is in fact dead cells. These cells are no longer living. So when they are constantly under friction or stress, They continually rub away, rub away, rub away until you start exposing the layers below it, the lucidum and the granulosum. This is where your skin tends to get raw, maybe even start to form a blister. But the stratum corneum is that outermost layer. I don't know if you've ever heard the statistic. I don't know if the numbers are actually true, but believe it or not, somewhere around like 60% of the dust located in any given spot where humans are located is actually composed of dead skin cells. So really and truly, dust on your desk, dust in your room, things like that is most likely composed of, or a large portion of, the dead skin cells that have been falling from your body or your family's body or whoever's in the classroom. It's kind of messed up to think about. So if we're looking at it from a layer standpoint, the stratum corneum, again, those dead cells that are keratinized and packed densely together, kind of flattened. You have the stratum lucidum, which is only present in thick skin. The stratum granulosum, now here the cells are still alive, but they're starting to flatten and produce that keratin protein. You have the stratum spinosum, which you will see as the thickest layer. These are the cells that are just after that stem cell phase. They're still dividing, they're still growing, they're still trying to become actual skin cells. And then you have the stratum basal or basal layer that actually is where those cells continually grow and reproduce and haven't exactly been fully told what they're supposed to be yet. I like to memorize them from, like I said, outside to in, because I don't know why I have this crazy, this stupid, what do you call it, anagram or whatever, but I like to take the first letter of all the layers, because all of them start with stratum. I like to take the C, the L, G, S, and B, and I call it Crazy Lazy Grandma's Spin Beats. Crazy Lazy Grandma's Spin Beats. That's how I remember the actual layers of the integument. Yes, I know it's cheeseball, I know it's corny, but for some reason I bet it worked for you. Crazy Lazy Grandma's Spin Beats. You're welcome. Just another visual for this. Corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basal. I like this one a lot better because it actually provides a brief description of what each layer is going on with those particular cells themselves. See how the stratum corneum, those cells are starting to flake away. So, from a standpoint of cell growth and reproduction, it takes about 2 to 4 weeks for one cell to move from the base layer or the basal layer to the most superficial layer, the corneum, and about 2 weeks to actually shed that entire top layer. So if you really did the math, the replenishing of your entire skin happens pretty frequently, believe it or not. What we're going to get into now is what determines skin color. You have these things called epidermal pigmentation. There's a couple different pigments that actually contribute to skin tone. One of them is called keratin. Don't get this confused with the dense, waterproof keratinization. This is keratin. Think of carrots. It actually has an orangish color to it. Carrots, orange. But it's essentially a pigment that is converted by vitamin A that has an orangish color. Melanin is a second pigmentation. So keratin produces some pigmentation of the skin, and so does melanin. Melanin is a pigment produced by a specific type of cell that is called melanocytes. Melanocytes tend to be a brown cell that produces a brown, yellowish brown, or black pigmentation. In how melanocytes increase the production of pigmentation is when they have extreme exposure to UV radiation. This is when you go out into the sun. Exposure to UV radiation stimulates melanocytes to produce additional melanin pigment, which is why you tan, or people can become darker in longer exposures to sunlight. Again, like I said, here. So you have the great Hambino from Sandlot, freckles, increased exposure to sunlight, stimulates those melanocytes. Melanin production, like I said, is what gives skin color of different races. So you can consider darker colored races to have an increased production of melanin itself. And the absence or The non-production of melanin is actually a genetic disorder called albinism. So if you look at this, all the different skin tones, I also think this is such an adorable picture. It's like a color spectrum of skin tone and race. Such a beautiful picture. And then this is the world distribution of skin tone color. So you have the color range graph, and you will notice the color distribution of skin tone. And here's a representation of what is called albinism, which is the absence of pigmentation or melanin. You'll notice it doesn't just affect the skin, it affects hair, and it actually affects their eyes themselves, because your iris has melanocytes in it that produce melanin, which is a pigmentation of your iris itself. Another thing that actually affects the color of your skin is actually dermal circulation. This is the circulation of blood in that dermal layer, not the epidermis, the dermis, because the epidermis does not have blood circulation. It's the dermis that does. But blood being red like it is can give skin a reddish color. So when you actually have your blood vessels dilated, that moves blood closer to the skin. Reasons your blood vessels will become more dilated can be various things. One, it's a fight or fight response. Whenever someone's excited or nervous or angry, you'll notice their face can turn red. That is the flushing of blood to the skin. That's why they say you look flush, but your blood vessels will dilate, moving more blood to the skin surface. The other reason is when you are, your blood carries a lot of heat in it. And when you are working out or something like that, too much increase in temperature of your internal environment is bad for cells. So your blood vessels will dilate because your blood is carrying so much thermal energy in it. When they dilate, it moves closer to the skin and allows for the transfer of thermal energy to outside of the body to the surrounding environment. Now, you can also have the opposite. When your blood vessels constrict, that gives them a pale color. So your blood vessels will constrict and no blood is visible at the surface. A lot of times this happens when you pass out, like maybe you see something extremely gross, you'll see somebody get pale and flush and then possibly pass out. Believe it or not, that's because blood is leaving those accessory structures of the face and ears and stuff like that, and then your blood's being prioritized. Extreme cases is called cyanosis. Cyanosis is essentially the bluing of the skin due to prolonged deprivation of oxygen. It's not the same as turning a pale color. This would be cyanosis due to lack of oxygen. Also, the bluing of the lips, lack of oxygen, sign of choking. All right, vitamin D. Vitamin D is made by converting a steroid in the body. So you take the steroid in the body in the presence of sunlight, and what happens is that calcitriol steroid and a hormone used for calcium, your body takes the steroid in the presence of sunlight and converts that into vitamin D. That vitamin D is super important. Calcitriol cannot function without vitamin D. The two of them work together in a chemical reaction that allow you to actually absorb calcium and phosphorus from the small intestine. So the calcium and phosphorus in the food that you eat is absorbed from the small intestine. What that results in, you have the ability then to build stronger bones. Your muscles function better, things of that nature. So no sunlight, no calcium or phosphorus absorbed, weaker bones. Unbelievable. All right, so that was all the epidermis we're talking about. Now let's talk about the dermis. So you can take the dermis and divide it into two layers. You have what is called the papillary layer. The papillary layer is composed of connective tissue, your blood vessels, your nerves, and all the things that supply the nutrients to the skin. So whenever you feel pain, you're not feeling it on the epidermis layer, you're feeling it in the dermis layer. I always go back to the example of when you have a splinter and you try to dig it out with a needle. When you get just under the skin, it really doesn't hurt. But if you stick that needle in just a little too far, that's when you start to feel pain. That's because you've left the epidermis layer and now you're in the dermal layer and you're actually striking nerves. You have also the reticular layer. The reticular layer is a very dense, interwoven connective tissue layer. You had reticulating connective tissue way back in Unit 2, but And it's composed of collagen fibers. Remember, collagen fibers have a give to them. They're not elastic, but they have a give or a cushiony effect to them. And what it does is that is the attachment point for the dermis. It's flexible and it has the ability to move. That's why when you take your fingers and you rub them together, the skin can move and shift, but it doesn't come detached. That reticular layer is what actually provides that. This is also going to be the location of your hair follicles. If you grab a hair and you yank it out, you see the skin on the bottom of it. That's essentially you yanking out the actual hair along with follicle, which is kind of deep. And believe it or not, if you rip out enough hair, you can cause somebody to bleed. Look at this rich blood supply. So when you cut yourself, you're getting through the dermis. You're getting through the epidermis down into the dermis. In extreme cases, when it bleeds quite a bit, you're getting through the epidermis, the dermis, and then you're down into the hypodermis, which we'll get into in just a minute. All right, so the layer below, subcutaneous, below skin, below the epidermis and the dermis is called the hypodermis. The function of this is it actually stabilizes skin position and relating to the underlying tissue, and it mostly consists of fat cells and other connective tissue. If you look down here, this is where all the fat or adipose tissue is going to be located. It's the underlying connective tissue that keeps the dermis and the epidermis in its place. Sites where you will have what is called subcutaneous injection, or subcutaneous injections are typically done with a hypodermic needle. So you're actually getting into the hypodermis rather than in the dermis or the epidermis, because injecting the shot there won't result in a whole lot of absorption into the body. So you actually have to get into that hypodermic layer or the subcutaneous layer. These are all places where you, anytime you have received a shot, this is typically where you will receive it. The arms, hips, I can't imagine how painful that would be. Legs, not as bad, but upper or lower back and upper buttocks region, that would not feel very good at all. And here are the three different types. So we do have intradermal injections. There are some functions for that. For example, I know some of you were talking about a TB or tuberculosis test. That's where they inject a small amount of a substance and it creates a bubble in your dermal and epidermal layer. You have the subcutaneous, so if the nurse ever goes in at an extreme angle, you have the intradermal. At a 45-degree angle, you have the subcutaneous. And if they just go straight at it, they're trying to get that into the muscle. These are the ones that hurt the most. So let's get into some of those accessory structures. I know this video is longer, but I just wanted to kill it in just one shot. So the accessory structures, hair. They project above the skin, except for in the soles of the feet, except they're not present in places called the soles of the feet, the palms, lips, and external genitalia. The actual hair that projects above the surface is in fact non-living. The only portion of the hair that is living is at the hair follicle, which is located in the deep dermis, just above the hypodermis. It is connected at the base to nerves and capillaries. Since right there it's continually growing, it needs nutrients, so that's why it has a blood supply, and it has nerve endings there for a couple reasons. One, for pain sensation, but also for movement. You ever notice that you can feel when somebody moves by you, or the slightest brush of air over your skin? It's the disturbance of those hair follicles in the actual nail itself. Or not the nail, the hair itself. What also is pretty sweet about hair is there's actually, on top of that, they have a muscle attached to them, and that muscle, it's called the erector pili muscle or pili muscle. When it's used for goosebumps. So whenever you are cold, it actually contracts and causes the hair follicle, pulls it down and causes the hairs to stand up. Other things, though, the root is in the boundary of the dead hair cells and the living hair cells, and then anchors to the skin. When hair grows, when living cells divide and push the dead cells out. So as you're at the hair follicle, when that hair grows, it actually grows in an outward direction and pushes more and more dead cells out. Those dead cells are, in fact, waterproof and keratinized. Other things you're going to see is there's typically going to be a gland associated with it. And that gland is actually going to secrete an oil to protect your hair and keep bacteria and other microorganisms out. This is an actual slide of the epidermal layer where a hair follicle is actually embedded into the dermis. Right. What's the purpose of having hair on your body besides your head? Well, protection, insulation, cushion, guard entrances, and provide sensations. Like I was talking about earlier, rector pili muscles cause your hair to stand up. Your hair color. Why is there different hair colors? Again, it comes down to melanocytes. That's when I mentioned albinism earlier. You would find that, believe it or not, that albinism is caused by a lack of melanocytes, and that's why hair actually ends up turning white also. So maybe when people turn gray, the melanocytes of their hair die off, no longer producing pigment. You also have sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are those that secrete oil. And that oily substance is called sebum. I don't know why, I hate that word. But what its main function is, it actually lubricates hair and skin and keeps infection away. And changes in sex hormone concentrations, typically that result from puberty, actually can cause accelerated secretion, and accelerated secretion results in clogged sebaceous glands. Clogged sebaceous gland ducts ends up becoming acne. So if you're looking at here, hair follicle, hair shaft or root, sebaceous gland secretes under the hair, boom. You also have sweat glands. There are two types, apocrine and merocrine, and that has to do with the type of secretion, but another term for sweat gland is called sudoriferous. I always just think of it as odor. But anyways, apocrine, what these do is they secrete onto the hair follicles in certain regions of the body. This is that sticky, cloudy, gross sweat, and this is what causes BO because it has an odorous substance in it. Merocrine, these are the kind that are more frequently and more numerous in the body. These are the ones that are directly secrete sweat onto the skin, mostly for the purposes of getting rid of heat. We already talked about how blood vessels beneath the dermis flush with blood to get rid of thermal energy. Michael Jordan, Gatorade. Oh, fingernails, the grossest thing. Fingernails and toenails. What their main thing is to do is they limit distortion under mechanical stress. Like I said, dead keratinized skin cells, waterproof. The pink color is due to the underlying blood vessels. So when you look at your fingernail and you see that it's pink underneath there, it's because there is blood circulating underneath there. But your fingernail's main purpose is to prevent stress to the actual fingertips, since they are one of the most widely used structures in the entire body. Blech. Alright, so what does your skin do for homeostasis? Skin has the ability to respond to stimuli. Remember, homeostasis is the maintaining of a stable working internal environment. So one of the things your skin does in order to do that is it creates calluses. Calluses are created in response to stimuli to those particular regions. It's essentially a buildup of a thicker layer of that outermost keratinized layer of dead skin cells. There's guitar calluses. Anybody that's played guitar has had those before. So what happens when you get cut? When you bleed? Here's what happens. So when you have injury to the skin, down to the dermal layer, bleeding occurs. The bleeding serves a function. Its main function, clot the region up. And then from that clot, you create a scab. The scab actually helps restore the integrity of the skin and keep out infection. So it actually keeps that region, it connects both halves of the cut, or all the sides of the cut, so it actually creates like a bridge between the two sides of the skin. What happens after that is the cells divide rapidly over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until they come back together and connect. Hair follicles, glands, etc. are rarely repaired in the skin. That's why scars themselves actually end up with no hair on them. For example here. Okay. What are burns? Well, burns are classified based on the severity and the depth of penetration of the burn and the total area infected. So there's various kinds. You have the superficial, which is the first degree. You just kind of get in that epidermis layer. A second degree burn is not so awesome. That's when you get down into that dermis. And when you have third degree or full thickness burns, you're getting all the way down into that hypodermic layer. Can you imagine touching something so hot that it melts away the flesh all the way down almost to the muscle? Blisters. So, what is a blister? If you think about it, typically no blood in a blister unless it is a blood blister, but it's essentially, oh my gosh, it's gross. It's essentially when you have the epidermis and possibly some of the dermis become detached from each other or from the underlying tissue, fill with fluid. That fluid helps actually protect that region from infection, from other wounds, from becoming more damaged while it heals and generates new skin. That's why they say don't pop a blister right away. Grosses me out. Believe it or not, that's it. I am so sorry this was a 30-minute one. I'll make it up to you by reducing the number of questions you have to answer in EduCanon. Thank you again. If you have any questions, please let me know.